In the soft light of a May morning in 2008, London stirred with its usual rhythm. Buses rumbling through narrow streets, the Thames flowing silently beneath its bridges, and the distant hum of a city that had long been a crossroads of empire and ideas. Yet, within this familiar pulse, an encounter unfolded that carried a weight far beyond the ordinary. Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, met the Dalai Lama, the exiled spiritual leader of Tibet, not at the political nerve center of 10 Downing Street, but at Lambeth Palace, the ancient residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury. This choice of venue, this subtle shift from the secular to the sacred, was no mere footnote in the annals of diplomacy. It was a gesture laden with meaning, a quiet ripple that spread across the surface of a world already trembling with unrest, economic ambition, and the ceaseless dance of power and principle. The year was 2008, a time when the globe seemed to teeter on the edge of transformation. Just months earlier, in March, the streets of Lhasa, Tibet's ancient capital, had erupted in protest, monks and laypeople alike raising their voices against decades of Chinese rule, only to be met with a swift and brutal crackdown. The images that flickered across Western screens were haunting. Crimson-robed figures clashing with armed forces, smoke rising from a city cradled by mountains, and a silence that followed, heavy with the unspoken. The Dalai Lama, who had fled Tibet in 1959 after a failed uprising against Beijing, watched from his exile in Dharamsala, India, his voice a steady call for peace and autonomy rather than independence, a nuance often lost in the clamor of geopolitics. China branded him a separatist, a wolf in monk's robes, while to millions across the world he was a beacon of compassion, a living embodiment of resilience in the face of loss. Gordon Brown, meanwhile, had ascended to the premiership less than a year earlier, inheriting a nation navigating its own uncertainties. The financial crisis loomed on the horizon, its shadow creeping closer with each passing day, while Britain's place in a shifting global order demanded delicate balancing acts. China, with its burgeoning economy and vast market, was a partner, too vital to ignore, yet the cries from Tibet could not be wholly dismissed, not by a leader who had once styled himself a man of moral conviction. The meeting with the Dalai Lama, then, was not a spontaneous act of goodwill, but a decision forged in the crucible of these competing forces. Scheduled for May 23rd during the Dalai Lama's 11-day visit to the UK, it arrived at a moment when the Sichuan earthquake had just devastated parts of China, killing tens of thousands and softening, if only briefly, the edges of Beijing's international image. The Beijing Olympics, too, were months away, a spectacle that would cast China's rise in golden light. For Brown, every step was a calculation, every gesture a potential fault line. The choice of Lambeth Palace was the first thread in this intricate tapestry. Unlike Tony Blair and John Major, who had welcomed the Dalai Lama to Downing Street in Niitisimanins, years past, Brown opted for a setting steeped in spiritual rather than political resonance. Lambeth, with its medieval stone and stained glass, stood apart from the utilitarian brick of government offices, a place where faith, not policy, held sway. To some, this was a deft maneuver, a way to honor the Dalai Lama's stature as a religious figure while sidestepping the full weight of a state-to-state confrontation with China. To others, it was a retreat, a signal of capitulation to Beijing's displeasure, a dilution of Britain's moral voice at a time when Tibet's wounds were raw and visible. The opposition seized on it, with figures like David Cameron decrying what they saw as kowtowing to economic pressures. Tibetan activists, too, voiced their disappointment, their placards outside Lambeth a silent rebuke to a government they felt had chosen trade over justice. Yet the Dalai Lama himself offered a different lens. Speaking to the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee the day before, on May 22nd, he brushed aside the controversy with a simplicity that belied his decades of struggle. "For me, no differences," he said, his voice soft but firm. "So long as meeting and talk, that is important." Here was a man who had lost a homeland, who had seen his people scattered and silenced, yet who refused to be ensnared by the symbolism of a building. His words carried the weight of a philosophy honed through suffering, a belief that the essence of progress lay not in grand gestures, but in the quiet persistence of dialogue. For 30 minutes behind closed doors, he and Brown spoke, their conversation described by Downing Street as warm and constructive. They touched on human rights in Tibet, the aftermath of the Sichuan disaster, and the faint hope of reconciliation between China and the Dalai Lama's envoys, and a hope Brown had pressed upon Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao earlier that year. It was a meeting of two men shaped by vastly different worlds, yet bound by a shared recognition of the fragility of their aims. China's response was swift and predictable. The Foreign Ministry, through spokesman Qin Gang, issued a statement of strong dissatisfaction and resolute opposition, framing the encounter as an affront to its sovereignty, a meddling in its internal affairs. Beijing's sensitivity was not new. Any nod to the Dalai Lama, however subtle, was a match struck near a powder keg, but it underscored the stakes of Brown's decision. The UK, like much of the West, found itself caught in a paradox. How to engage a rising power without turning a blind eye to its shadows? The economic ties were undeniable. China's factories fueled British shelves, its investments propped up faltering markets. Yet the moral question lingered, a whisper that refused to fade. Brown's choice of Lambeth Palace can be read as an attempt to thread this needle, to extend a hand to the Dalai Lama without fully grasping the thorn of China's wrath. But in doing so, he risked a deeper critique, that in seeking to offend no one, he stood for nothing. This moment, this quiet meeting in a city far from the Himalayan plateau, opens a window onto a question as old as human society. What does it mean to wield power responsibly when ideals and necessity collide? Gordon Brown was no tyrant, no philosopher king, but a man thrust into leadership at a time when every choice carried echoes. His decision reflected the pragmatism of Machiavelli, who taught that power endures only when it adapts to the currents of the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. To meet the Dalai Lama at Downing Street might have been a bolder statement, a clarion call for justice that reverberated across continents, but it might also have strained a relationship that Britain, in its post-imperial recalibration, could ill afford to fracture. The Sichuan earthquake had stirred global sympathy for China. The Olympics promised a stage for its ascendancy. In this light, Lambeth Palace was a compromise, a way to acknowledge the Dalai Lama's voice without amplifying it to a pitch that Beijing could not ignore. Yet compromise, for all its utility, carries a shadow. To critics, it was a retreat from principle, a moment when Britain's moral compass wavered under the weight of economic expediency. The Dalai Lama's cause, autonomy for Tibet, dignity for its people, was not a trivial one. It was a plea rooted in the universal language of freedom, a language Britain had long claimed to champion. By stepping back from the political stage, Brown risked muting that plea, reducing a cry for justice to a whisper of spirituality. The utilitarian calculus is clear. The greatest good for the greatest number might favor stability with China over solidarity with Tibet. But philosophy demands more than numbers. It asks what we lose when we trade the soul of a cause for the comfort of the ledger. In the quiet halls of Lambeth, that question hung unanswered, a specter amid the pleasantries. The Dalai Lama, in his response, offers a counterpoint that cuts through the noise. His indifference to the venue, his focus on the act of meeting itself, reflects a wisdom that transcends the political fray. Here is a man who has seen empires rise and fall, who has borne witness to the impermanence of all things, a core tenet of the Buddhism he embodies. To him, the trappings of are fleeting. What endures is the intention behind the act, the ripple of connection that might, in time, shift the tide. His words echo the Stoics, who taught that we must attend to what lies within our control, and let go of the rest. He could not dictate Brown's choices, nor silence China's protests, but he could speak, listen, and plant a seed of possibility. In this, he wielded a different kind of power, not the coercive force of nations, but the quiet strength of presence, a strength that asks nothing yet offers everything. Their meeting, then, becomes a dance of contrasts. Brown, the statesman, bound by the machinery of governance, and the Dalai Lama, the exile unbound by borders yet tethered to a cause. It is tempting to cast them as archetypes, the pragmatist versus the idealist, the temporal versus the eternal. But such labels oversimplify the truth. Brown was no stranger to ideals. His early writings brimmed with calls for justice and equality, echoes of a Scottish upbringing steeped in moral rigor. The Dalai Lama, too, was no dreamer detached from reality. His advocacy for dialogue with China, his rejection of violence, showed a pragmatism born of necessity. Both men, in their way, grappled with the same riddle: how to navigate a world where power and principle are not allies but adversaries, forever tugging at the seams of human endeavor. This tension is not theirs alone. It is ours, woven into the fabric of existence. Hegel saw history as a dialectic, a clash of forces that births progress through struggle. In 2008, the struggle played out on a small stage. Tibet's aspirations, clashing with China's sovereignty, Britain's conscience clashing with its commerce. Brown and the Dalai Lama were not its architects but its actors, caught in a script they could only partly rewrite. The Chinese government's reaction, sharp, unyielding, reminded the world that power does not yield to sentiment. Tibet remained, a pawn in a larger game, its mountains a silent witness to a drama unfolding far beyond their peaks. Yet the meeting itself, however modest its outcomes, was a refusal to let that silence reign absolute. It was a moment of resistance, however muted, against the erasure of a people's voice. To judge it solely by its aftermath, China's unchanged stance, Tibet's unresolved fate, is to miss its deeper resonance. The encounter at Lambeth Palace was not a triumph nor a betrayal, but a fragment of something larger, the human attempt to align what ought to be with what is. Brown's caution reflected the burdens of leadership, the knowledge that every step ripples outward, touching lives he would never see. The Dalai Lama's grace reflected the liberation of detachment, the belief that meaning lies not in victory, but in the act of striving. Together, they embodied a paradox that defines us all. We are creatures of both flesh and spirit, bound by the world yet reaching beyond it. In the Buddhist vision the Dalai Lama carries, existence is a web of interdependence, a tapestry where every thread, every choice, matters. Suffering, he teaches, demands compassion, not avoidance. Conflict demands dialogue, not despair. Brown, in his utilitarian frame, saw existence as a balance sheet, a series of trade-offs where the good of the many might eclipse the cries of the few. Neither view is wholly right nor wholly wrong. They are two halves of a fractured whole, two voices in a conversation that has no end. Their meeting was a fleeting harmony in that discord, a moment when the political and the philosophical brushed against each other, neither yielding, neither prevailing. What lingers years later is not the policy it shaped or the headlines it spawned, but the question it leaves behind. How do we dance this dance of power and principle without losing ourselves? Brown, in his hesitancy, reminds us that leadership is not a pedestal, but a crucible, a place where ideals are tested against the fire of consequence. The Dalai Lama, in his steadfastness, reminds us that principle is not a luxury, but a lifeline, a thread that holds us to something greater than survival. In the quiet of Lambeth Palace, they met not as opposites, but as mirrors, reflecting the struggle that lives in every heart, to be both of the world and beyond it, to act with purpose in a universe that offers no certainties. The date was May 23, 2008. The place was London, a city that has seen kings fall and empires fade. The players were a prime minister and a monk, two men whose paths converged for 30 minutes in a world that rarely pauses. Their meeting was not a solution, not a revolution, but a pause, a breath in the relentless march of history. And in that breath, we glimpse the eternal, the courage to keep dancing, however faltering the steps, however dim the light. For in the end, it is not the destination that defines us, but the movement itself. The fragile, flawed, beautiful attempt to bridge the gap between what we are and what we might become.